By late 1917, a machine was crawling through the ruins of a French village, dragging smoke and fire behind it. To the men who watched it pass, it looked less like a weapon than a monster, steel-skinned, indifferent, unstoppable. This is the story of how it got there. 3 years earlier, the war had frozen. Millions of men faced each other across a few hundred yards of mud, sheltering behind wire, concrete, and dug earth built to withstand anything infantry could throw at it. The trench had become unbreakable, and someone had to invent a way through it. The answer arrived as a rumor before it arrived as a weapon, a machine that could cross trenches, crush wire, and shrug off rifle fire. When it finally appeared, soldiers on both sides struggled to describe it. Official photographers rushed to capture proof of the thing, guns apparently firing as it climbed from a shell hole, moving like nothing anyone had seen, slow and strangely alive in the dust it kicked up around itself. That first appearance came on the 15th of September, 1916, on the Somme. Fewer than 50 tanks were ready, and mud and mechanical failure took most out of the fight before they reached the German line. C-15 stalled near Thiepval, Clan Leslie ground forward through Chimpanzee Valley toward Flers. The gains were small. The shock was not. German soldiers broke and ran from a machine they had no name for. 7 months later, at Arras, the second generation went in. Mark II tanks, Lusitania among them, pushed down a ruined street toward the German line, their armor already redesigned after the Somme. Machines that survived the day limped home running on fumes, patched and refueled for whatever came next. None of this tells you what it was like inside. A tank's engine ran in the same sealed box as its crew, and temperatures could climb past 50 degrees Celsius. Carbon monoxide leaked from the exhaust and pooled in the hull. Men wore leather and chainmail masks against bullet splash, and still came out gassed and deafened, unable to hear an order at point-blank range. There was no radio, crew signaled with flags, pigeons, or a spanner banged on the hull, and some were dragged out unconscious before reaching the enemy line. But the machine had a weakness the engineers hadn't solved: the ground itself. In the autumn of 1917, at Passchendaele, the tanks met mud deep enough to swallow them whole. Photograph after photograph from that front tells the same story: a tank sunk to its hull, abandoned where it stalled. That same autumn, over 400 tanks were massing in secret at a driving school near Whaley, training for an attack that would break the war's own rules: no bombardment to warn the enemy, no days of shelling to churn the ground into a swamp, just tanks crawling out of the mist at dawn, meant to cross the wire before anyone could stop them. Then, on the 20th of November, 1917, the training paid off, for one morning. Hundreds of tanks advanced together at Cambrai, crushing wire that would once have taken a week of shelling to clear. The Germans fell back. Church bells rang in London before the lines had stabilized. But the tanks that broke through also passed the war's older, uglier evidence: the dead, left where cavalry had ridden past them minutes before. The German counterattack came fast, and it came hard. Tanks that had broken through were now stranded, ditched, picked apart by artillery, left twisted among the trees and shattered streets around Fontaine, Flesquières, and Rumilly. What had looked, for a few hours, like the future of warfare now looked like scrap. But even a wrecked tank was a lesson. German engineers climbed over the abandoned hulls, studying rivets and armor plate. The Kaiser himself came to Cambrai that December to thank the crews who salvaged them. Some were repaired, repainted with iron crosses, and turned back against the army that built them. Deborah, knocked out at Flesquières, never moved again. Germany's own answer, the A7V, was slower, top-heavy, and desperately short in number. Fewer than 20 were ever built, against thousands of Allied tanks. But on the 24th of April, 1918, near Villers-Bretonneux, 3 A7Vs met 3 British Mark IVs in the open, and for the first time in history, tanks fired on tanks. One of the 3, nicknamed Elfried, overturned in the fighting and was left where she fell, proof the machine built to end the stalemate had just met its own kind. By 1918, a lighter tank had arrived, built not to smash through a line but to race past it. The Whippet could outrun a walking man and keep going for hours, changing how the final offensives were fought, no longer just breaking the line, but chasing what broke. On the 8th of August, 1918, over 400 tanks led the opening attack at Amiens, a day Erich Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German army. A corporal stood beside his camouflaged Mark V, J-18, in a cornfield near Albert. From another tank, a carrier pigeon was released through a porthole to carry word of the advance back to headquarters, because no radio yet existed that could do it faster. The tank had also stopped being a Western Front machine only. Far from Flanders mud, British Markis rolled through the Tigris Valley in Mesopotamia, proof this was no longer an experimental weapon confined to one battlefield, but a piece of equipment the army expected to use anywhere. When the fighting stopped, crowds in London, New York, and Berlin all found a reason to cheer the same machine, paraded down Fifth Avenue to sell war bonds, driven past ruined Reichstag windows weeks later during the chaos of revolution, on either side of a fight it was never designed for. Away from the parades, a smaller argument was underway. Officers like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart wrote that the tank should never again be leashed to walking infantry, that it should lead, in independent armored formations, deep behind an enemy's lines. Most Allied staff shelved the idea as too costly for peacetime. In Germany, the same officers who once studied hulls at Cambrai read it more carefully, and, 20 years later, it came back as blitzkrieg. Today, what survives sits behind museum glass, disarmed and studied rather than feared. But somewhere in every one of these machines is the mud of Passchendaele, the smoke of the Somme, the wreckage of Cambrai, and the 3 years of stalemate that made them necessary.